Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. June 26, 1944, Hollandia Air Base, Dutch New Guinea. Picture this: a humid afternoon, the steady hum of engines in the distance, and a half-finished game of checkers resting on a wooden table. Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald leans forward, eyes fixed on the board, locked in quiet battle with Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Smith, the operations officer of the famed Satan's Angels. Suddenly, a shadow falls across the screen door. A civilian stands there, calm, self-assured. He introduces himself, but the name barely registers at first. MacDonald, intent on his next move, hardly looks up. Then it sinks in. Charles Lindbergh. The Charles Lindbergh, the man who had once crossed the Atlantic alone, now stood here, in a makeshift recreation hall on the far side of the world, asking to talk about P-38 combat operations. Imagine the scene. America's most celebrated aviator, surrounded by the scent of engine oil and jungle air, stepping into a war zone not as a legend, but as a student eager to learn and teach. Neither Lindbergh nor MacDonald could know that this brief interruption, this pause in a game of checkers, would ignite a revolution in the way long-range fighter missions were flown across the Pacific. Within 6 weeks, the techniques Lindbergh would share would stretch the operational reach of the Lockheed P-38 Lightning by almost 400 miles. What had once seemed the impossible dream of pilots weary from fuel limits would soon become standard practice. But this is not just the story of a new flight method. It is a story of disbelief transformed into conviction, of rigid doctrine undone by proof in the sky. It is the tale of seasoned fighter pilots learning to trust mathematics more than instinct, and of one man's lifelong obsession with fuel efficiency rewriting the playbook of aerial warfare. You see, the formulas of endurance weren't being penned in engineering manuals. They were being discovered in the air by men whose every mission redrew the limits of what engines and courage could achieve. And leading them was a 42-year-old civilian who just 3 days earlier had never flown a P-38. How did he get here, to this remote corner of the Pacific, knocking on the door of a U.S. Army officer? The answer begins 17 years earlier over the vast gray expanse of the Atlantic. May 20th to 21st, 1927. Charles Augustus Lindbergh, young, determined, almost painfully methodical, lifted his silver monoplane, the Spirit of St. Louis, from Roosevelt Field in New York and aimed it toward Paris, alone. 33.5 hours later, after traversing 3,600 miles of ocean and cloud, he descended onto Le Bourget Field, greeted by a roaring sea of humanity. His aircraft, a Ryan NYP, carried 450 gallons of fuel, so much that the tanks blocked any forward view. Lindbergh navigated by periscope and dead reckoning, trimming power, adjusting mixture, nursing every drop of fuel with the focus of a watchmaker. When his wheels finally touched French soil, 85 gallons still sloshed in the tanks. Fuel economy, once deemed impossible for a Wright whirlwind radial engine, had become reality, a triumph of discipline over doubt. That flight did more than bridge continents. It defined Lindbergh's genius. In the years that followed, as he conducted survey flights for Pan American Airways across both the Atlantic and Pacific, he refined those same techniques, stretching aircraft far beyond their advertised limits. He understood something few others did. The official range, printed in manuals, was merely an average, not a boundary. Every engine, every airframe had its own secret rhythm, a precise harmony where power, fuel burn, and mechanical strain met in perfect balance. To find it, demanded not just skill, but intuition, a deep, almost intimate understanding of the dialogue between manifold pressure, propeller RPM, fuel mixture, and airspeed. Lindbergh had mastered that language, and soon he would teach it to men who thought they already knew how to fly. By 1944, Charles Lindbergh was a man divided between genius and controversy, a master of long-range flight whose relationship with his own nation's military had soured under the weight of politics. Imagine it. One of America's greatest heroes, the Lone Eagle himself, now viewed with suspicion by the very government that had once celebrated him. Before the war, Lindbergh had taken a firm stand against American intervention in Europe. He became the leading voice of the America First Committee, arguing that the United States should stay out of foreign wars. His eloquence made him famous, but his stance made him enemies, none more powerful than President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Their clash became bitterly personal. On April 29, 1941, after Roosevelt publicly likened him to Clement Vallandigham, the Civil War-era sympathizer of the Confederacy, Lindbergh resigned his commission as a colonel in the Army Air Corps Reserve. When Pearl Harbor shattered isolationism and thrust America into global war, Lindbergh tried to return to uniform. He offered his service to the Army Air Corps, but Roosevelt made certain he would never again wear military wings. Officially, he was grounded, yet expertise like his cannot be silenced. It finds its own path. Denied a commission, Lindbergh became a civilian technical consultant, moving between manufacturers and proving grounds. In 1943, he joined United Aircraft Corporation, immersing himself in the work of its Chance Vought division, creators of the F-4U Corsair. He tackled issues at Ford's Willow Run plant, improving production of the B-24 Liberator. He flew dangerous high-altitude tests in P-47 Thunderbolts, pushing engines to their limits for performance data. He even refined dive-bombing procedures for the Corsair, blending mathematics, mechanics, and intuition into innovations that saved lives. Still, the aviator inside him, the man who had crossed the Atlantic alone, longed for combat. Observation and theory were no longer enough. By early 1944, opportunity appeared in an unexpected form. United Aircraft wanted to study the practicality of twin-engine fighters. The premier American example? The Lockheed P-38 Lightning? Lindbergh proposed a bold plan. He would travel to the Pacific Theater as a civilian representative, observing the P-38 in active combat. On April 3, 1944, he prepared for deployment. At Brooks Brothers in New York, he purchased a naval officer's uniform without insignia, a careful disguise for a man technically forbidden from serving. Then, at Brentano's bookstore, he bought a small New Testament, noting in his journal, "Since I can only carry one book, and a very small one, that is my choice. It would not have been a decade ago, but the more I learn and the more I read, the less competition it has." On April 24th, he departed San Diego, officially bound for Marine aviation bases near Guadalcanal. His mission carried Navy Department authorization, but was deliberately hidden from the White House. Neither Roosevelt nor Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox had any idea that Lindbergh was heading into a war zone. What was meant to be quiet observation soon evolved into something else entirely. When Marine Corps officers invited him to fly as an observer on real combat missions, Lindbergh accepted without hesitation. On May 21, 1944, he flew his first combat sortie, a strafing run with Marine Fighting Squadron Tukwao II against Japanese positions near Rabaul. Officially, he was there to watch. In reality, he fought. Lindbergh's guns were loaded, and he used them when targets presented themselves. Almost immediately, he proved his worth. Working alongside Corsair pilots, he taught them how to double their bomb load safely, pushing the F-4U beyond its rated capacity without risking fatal takeoff accidents. Through careful analysis of power settings, takeoff speeds, and weight distribution, Lindbergh turned what had been a deadly problem into a tactical advantage. Word began to spread through the Pacific. The famous Charles Lindbergh was not only flying combat missions as a civilian, but solving problems that had baffled seasoned military engineers for months. By mid-June 1944, his curiosity turned toward the P-38 Lightning. United Aircraft's interest in the twin-engine design was real, but Lindbergh had also heard of a remarkable unit, the 475th Fighter Group, known as Satan's Angels. They were legends in the Pacific, fierce, innovative, and always in the thick of the fight. If he wanted to truly understand the Lightning, that was where he needed to be. On June 15th, Lindbergh caught a flight to Finschhafen, New Guinea, and soon after reported to 5th Air Force Headquarters at Nadzab, where he lunched with Colonel Marion Cooper. 3 days later, on Sunday evening, June 18th, he dined with General Ennis Whitehead, discussing New Guinea operations and his intention to observe P-38 missions firsthand. His authorization was informal, no paperwork, no official assignment. But in the fluid, improvisational command structure of the Southwest Pacific, personal credibility often mattered more than bureaucratic approval. Lindbergh's name, skill, and reputation were all the clearance he needed. On June 20th, he spent 1 hour and 20 minutes getting checked out in a P-38 with the 35th Squadron of the 8th Fighter Group, his first time at the controls of the twin-boomed machine that would soon define his wartime contribution. 6 days later, June 26, 1944, he stepped into the humid air of Hollandia Air Base and interrupted Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald's checkers game. MacDonald, just 29 and already a 10-kill ace, commanded the 475th Fighter Group. 3 elite squadrons, the 401st, 402nd, and 403rd, all flying the newest P-38J models with improved intercoolers and expanded fuel tanks. These were the longest-range fighters in the Pacific, the cutting edge of Allied air power, yet even they struggled. Missions to distant targets left little margin for fuel. Dogfights and bad weather often meant returning home on fumes. Some pilots never made it back. At first, MacDonald regarded Lindbergh with polite disinterest, eager to return to his game. But when Lindbergh mentioned that General Hutchinson, commander of the 3rd Air Task Force, had personally sent him to discuss P-38 combat operations, MacDonald listened. Their brief conversation ended with an invitation, "Would you like to fly with us tomorrow?" Lindbergh accepted without hesitation. The mission would launch at dawn. Rather than send him back to headquarters, MacDonald offered a spare cot at the 475th's camp. That night, as Lindbergh settled into his bunk beneath the tropical canopy, word spread like wildfire through the group. Charles Lindbergh, the Lone Eagle himself, was flying with Satan's Angels. Charles Lindbergh was flying with Satan's Angels. The news spread through the 475th Fighter Group like wildfire, carried on the humid New Guinea air from tent to tent. Reactions were immediate and mixed. Some pilots could hardly contain their excitement. Lieutenant John Purdy of the 433rd Squadron was eager to meet the legendary flyer whose name had filled the pages of every aviation history book. But others, hardened combat veterans, were skeptical. Could a 42-year-old civilian, however famous, truly handle the brutal demands of modern aerial warfare? Among the doubters was Major Thomas McGuire, already credited with 15 victories, a man who would later end the war as America's second highest-scoring ace, with 38 confirmed kills. McGuire wasn't hostile. just curious. He wanted to see firsthand what the old man could do. The morning of June 27, 1944, dawned gray and wet. Rain drummed steadily on the metal wings of the P-38s parked along the airstrip at Hollandia. By 05:30 hours, the weather was miserable, the low clouds hanging thick and heavy. Yet by 10:30, the tropical sun had begun to break through, and the order came to take off. Lieutenant Colonel Charles McDonald led a flight of 4 aircraft toward Jeffman Island and Samart Airfield, familiar targets for the 475th. Lindbergh flew as Blue 3, tucked neatly on McGuire's wing, while Lieutenant Colonel Merrill Smith, an 8 Victory ace, flew the remaining position. McDonald watched as Lindbergh's P-38 eased into formation, smooth, precise, flawless. For a man who had first flown the Lightning barely a week earlier, his control was uncanny. Their mission that day was to strafe an enemy barge in Kaibo's Bay. As the formation swept down, anti-aircraft bursts peppered the sky, black smoke and orange flame cutting through the humid air. Lindbergh wove through the flak with the calm of experience, his cannon and machine guns blazing as his rounds tore across the barge's deck. Within minutes, the target was destroyed. The 4 Lightnings turned for home, and all landed safely. Yet the true significance of the mission wasn't in the gunfire or the explosions. It was discovered afterward, on the ground. When the crew chiefs checked the aircraft, they noticed something strange. Lindbergh's P-38, though flown on the same mission under the same conditions, consistently returned with far more fuel than the others. After a 6.5-hour armed reconnaissance along the western shore of Gilwink Bay on July 1st, he landed with 210 gallons still in his tanks. His wingmen's gauges were nearly empty. 2 days later, on July 3rd, the 475th escorted 16 B-25 bombers to strike Jeffman Island. Afterward, they turned to hunt enemy barges. Within an hour, 2 pilots called it quits. Low fuel forced them home. Lindbergh, however, continued the patrol easily, his gauges still showing comfortable reserves. Colonel McDonald took notice. This wasn't luck. It was a pattern. 2 days later, he gathered his pilots in their crude recreation hall, a simple structure of palm thatch and packed dirt, lit by a few bare bulbs. A ping-pong table and some playing cards were the only decorations. The men sat, restless, curious, a few skeptical smirks flickering in the dim light. McDonald introduced Lindbergh formally, then gestured toward him. "Gentlemen," he said, "our guest has been flying the same missions you have, but his plane keeps bringing back more fuel than anyone else's. I think we should hear why." Lindbergh stepped forward. He spoke plainly, without bravado. The secret, he explained, wasn't in the plane. It was in how you treated it. Standard P-38 procedure, he reminded them, called for cruising at 2,200 to 400 RPM, mixture set to auto-rich. That gave reliable power, but it also wasted enormous amounts of fuel. Lindbergh had tested a different method. By reducing engine speed to 1,600 RPM, setting the mixture to auto-lean, and slightly increasing manifold pressure to 30 inches of mercury, a pilot could maintain nearly the same airspeed, around 185 mil/h indicated, while cutting fuel consumption dramatically. In hard numbers, that meant about 70 gallons per hour, roughly 2.6 miles per gallon, a staggering improvement over standard consumption. Lindbergh told them that using these settings, the Lightning's combat radius could extend by 400 miles, making 9-hour missions possible. When he finished, the room went silent. The pilots shifted uneasily. 9 hours in a P-38? They could barely endure 7. The cockpit was cramped and unforgiving. Parachute beneath, emergency raft below that, survival suit tight around their limbs. The thought of 2 extra hours felt less like strategy and more like punishment. But that wasn't what truly unsettled them. Lindbergh was telling them to run their engines over square, with manifold pressure higher than RPM, something every military flight instructor had drilled into them never to do. Over square operation, they'd been warned, meant engine detonation, overheating, and catastrophic failure, the kind of mistake that could send a pilot spinning into the sea. Now, here was a civilian, a legend, yes, but still a civilian, calmly suggesting they should ignore their training and do it routinely. The room buzzed with disbelief. Some exchanged glances, others shook their heads. One pilot even muttered aloud that Lindbergh's technique was dangerous nonsense. But MacDonald wasn't so sure. Lindbergh wasn't preaching theory. He had already flown combat missions using those settings, and his engines hadn't failed. His P-38 had returned each time with generous fuel reserves that could mean the difference between life and death. MacDonald decided the idea deserved a test. If it worked, the 475th would gain a decisive edge. If it didn't, they'd find out soon enough. Over the following week, pilots began to experiment cautiously. Short flights first, quick hops that would allow emergency returns if anything went wrong. Those first reports came back tentative, almost nervous. Pilots noted that their engines sounded strange at the lower RPM, deeper, slower, unfamiliar. But they kept flying, and soon something extraordinary began to happen. The deep, rhythmic growl of the Allison V-1710 engines took on a new tone, slower, steadier, almost deliberate. But the gauges told the truth the pilots could trust. Temperatures held steady. Oil pressure remained solid. The dreaded cylinder head spikes that signaled detonation never came. In fact, the engines ran cooler than before. That first week, anxiety began to melt into cautious confidence. Then confidence became conviction. Pilots started to stretch their missions farther and farther, applying Lindbergh's strange-sounding settings over open ocean and enemy territory. The results were undeniable. Flights that once demanded a desperate, fuel-pinching return after a single strike now allowed extended combat air patrols. Reconnaissance runs that had ended with needles trembling near empty now finished with fuel to spare. The P-38's effective combat radius, once a limiting 570 miles, began to grow. 700 miles, then 750. Suddenly, pilots were reaching targets once considered untouchable, lingering to fight for 15 minutes over the objective, and still returning home with an hour's worth of fuel in reserve. The transformation was nothing short of revolutionary. Skepticism vanished, replaced by admiration. Mission after mission confirmed it. Lindbergh's civilian trick wasn't dangerous. It was brilliant. He became more than a guest. He was a mentor, a fellow warrior. He flew regularly with the 475th Fighter Group, logging combat hours, leading sorties, teaching by example. When he led a flight, his call sign was simple: Mr. Lindbergh. In the evenings, he explained the why. He talked about the physics behind what the pilots were feeling in their hands and hearing in their engines. An aircraft engine, he told them, is just a machine for turning fuel into pressure, pressure into power. The trick isn't making more power, it's making the right power, the most you can get for every drop you burn. He broke it down so even the most hard-bitten combat pilot could understand. High RPM meant the pistons were cycling furiously, gulping fuel whether the aircraft needed it or not. By lowering RPM but raising manifold pressure, the same thrust could be achieved through fewer, more efficient combustion strokes. Running auto-lean mixture made the burn cleaner, eliminating the excess fuel normally used in auto-rich mode for engine cooling at high power. It wasn't magic, it was mechanics, and crucially, it wasn't dangerous. Yes, the technique looked over square on paper, the manifold pressure reading higher than the RPM, but in reality, the power level was moderate. 30 inches of mercury was tame compared to the 60-inch war emergency settings used for takeoff or combat. And those slower RPMs actually reduced mechanical stress, sparing pistons and bearings instead of punishing them. Lindbergh's secret weapon wasn't defiance of rules, it was understanding their limits. His authority came not from rank, but from mastery. His 1927 Atlantic crossing had already proven that manufacturer charts were merely suggestions, not laws. During the 1930s, while surveying routes for Pan-American Airways across the world's longest oceanic gaps, he had tested every variable of fuel flow, airspeed, and mixture thousands of times. And the P-38 gave him the perfect laboratory. With its twin engines, experimentation carried a safety margin no single-engine pilot could afford. If one Allison failed, the other could still bring the Lightning home. Over the endless Pacific, where a sputtering motor meant death by drowning or capture by the Japanese, that redundancy mattered. Lindbergh also knew logistics were on his side. The Allison plant was shipping engines and parts to the Pacific in ample numbers. If an engine suffered from experimental wear, ground crews could replace it within days. The trade-off was worth it, and his math was right. Not a single P-38 engine failed because of Lindbergh's cruise settings. By late July 1944, the Lindbergh method had spread across the 5th Air Force's P-38 units. Word of mouth carried it faster than any memo could. Pilots whispered the numbers. 1,600 RPM, 30 inches, auto lean, 185 indicated, like a secret code. Ground crews compared fuel returns, shaking their heads in disbelief. Other commanders wanted in. Lindbergh began giving informal briefings to pilots from neighboring squadrons, calm, methodical sessions where he fielded questions, addressed fears, and explained in patient detail why their engines wouldn't explode. Adoption wasn't universal, but it grew. The results spoke for themselves. Then came July 28, 1944, a date that would give Lindbergh his most dramatic moment in combat. The mission was a bomber escort to the Ceram area, flown with the 433rd Squadron. Lindbergh took his usual position as Blue 3 in a 4-ship flight. Over El Paputi Bay, Blue Flight encountered enemy aircraft. 2 Mitsubishi Ki-51 Sonyas, light bombers used for reconnaissance and ground attack. They were from the 73rd Independent Flying Chutai, returning from a search mission. One was flown by Captain Saburo Shimada, the unit's commanding officer, the other by Sergeant Yokogi. The Americans dove to attack. By every measure, the Sonyas were outclassed, slower, less agile, and lightly armed. Against the twin-engine Lightnings, they should have been easy prey. But Captain Shimada was no novice. Determined not to die quietly, he turned the fight into a running, twisting engagement that churned across the bay. P-38s from the 9th Fighter Squadron had engaged first and were already pressing hard when McDonald's flight arrived overhead. In the chaos, Lieutenant Wade Lewis raked Yokogi's Sonya with cannon fire. The Japanese aircraft shuddered, smoke trailing from its fuselage as it fell away. The duel was far from over. The Sonya's left wing burst into flames, a ribbon of orange and black smoke unraveling behind it. The crippled bomber tried to level out and run, but Lieutenant J.C. Haslip slid in smoothly behind and fired a long, punishing burst. Tracers stitched across the fuselage. The Japanese plane shuddered, trailed a widening column of smoke, and then plunged into the sea, vanishing in a hiss of steam and spray. only Captain Saburo Shimada's Sonya remained. For 30 relentless minutes, Shimada fought like a man possessed. He threw his light bomber through gut-wrenching turns, pushing the aircraft to its absolute limits. Each time a P-38 tried to draw a bead, the Sonya twisted away, wingtips trailing condensation, the little aircraft knifing through the air in impossible arcs. The faster American fighters couldn't hold him in their sights. Their advantage in speed became a handicap in the slow-turning fight. Captain Danforth Miller, flying as McDonald's wingman, managed to swing the Sonya briefly into his gun sight. He fired. Bright streams of tracers lanced ahead, but Shimada yanked into a brutal left turn. Miller's rounds missed by 80 feet. Then Shimada did something no one expected. He turned directly toward Lindbergh. The two aircraft hurtled toward each other, closing at nearly 500 miles per hour. For Charles Lindbergh, who had flown more miles than any man alive but had never before faced an enemy intent on killing him, time seemed to freeze. Shimada held his course, the Mitsubishi Ki-51 filling Lindbergh's windscreen. Whether the Japanese captain intended to ram or simply exchange fire head-on, it no longer mattered. Lindbergh steadied his hands. He sighted on the Sonya's radial engine and pressed the trigger. The P-38 Lightning's nose guns, one 20mm cannon, and four 50-caliber machine guns roared together. Tracers streaked forward in a dense, blinding stream. Lindbergh held the trigger for 6 full seconds, the concentrated fire hammering into the Sonya's front fuselage. The enemy propeller began to slow, the blades turning sluggishly. Black smoke erupted from the engine cowling, but still Shimada came on. At the last instant, Lindbergh hauled back hard on the yoke. The Lightning shot upward, the enemy aircraft flashing beneath, so close he could almost feel the turbulence in his controls. Below, Shimada's Sonya rolled into a steep, dying dive. Other P-38s fired short bursts as it fell, but the damage was already fatal. The Japanese aircraft struck the sea in a violent column of white spray, the explosion swallowed almost instantly by the ocean. Ripples spread outward, concentric circles fading into the blue. Moments later, the surface was calm again, as if nothing had happened. Captain Saburo Shimada and his observer were gone. Back at Hollandia, the pilots debated the kill credit. Several had fired on the Sonya, McDonald, Miller, and Lindbergh among them, but all agreed it was Lindbergh's head-on burst that had crippled the Japanese plane and sent it diving to its death. Officially, the victory was never recorded. Lindbergh was still a civilian technical representative, not a commissioned combat pilot. Listing a confirmed kill under his name would draw uncomfortable scrutiny from Washington and likely end his assignment. The consensus among the men was clear. The credit would remain unofficial, but the truth was understood. Charles Lindbergh had scored his only aerial victory. 3 days later, on August 1st, 1944, his luck almost ran out. The mission was a fighter sweep to the Palau Islands. The formation encountered Japanese Zeros, and a swirling dogfight erupted. Lindbergh found himself locked in a turning fight with one nimble enemy. The Zero slid in behind him, cannons flashing, bullets slicing past the P-38's canopy. "Break right! Break right!" McDonald shouted over the radio. Lindbergh yanked the controls over, feeling the crushing G-forces as tracer fire whipped through the space his Lightning had just occupied. McDonald dove in to intercept, catching the Zero in a burst that sent it spinning down. The fight ended, but the message was clear. Lindbergh had pushed his luck as far as it would go. At 5th Air Force Headquarters, the decision came swiftly. He had proven his point and nearly paid for it with his life. Over the course of his Pacific tour, Lindbergh had flown around 50 combat missions, roughly 25 of them in P-38s with the 475th Fighter Group. He had taught tested, and fought. He had shot down an enemy plane. He had survived being shot at. And that, the brass decided, was enough. On August 12, 1944, Lindbergh climbed into a transport at Hollandia to return home. The men of the 475th Fighter Group, Satan's Angels, gathered on the airstrip to see him off. Their respect was absolute. He hadn't just lectured them on fuel management. He had flown beside them, bled the same risk, and earned their trust in the only way that mattered, through action. His influence didn't end with his departure. By October 1944, virtually every P-38 unit in the Pacific was using some version of Lindbergh's cruise control method. Pilots adjusted the numbers slightly to match conditions, but the principle held: lower RPM, higher manifold pressure, leaner mixture. The result was the same everywhere: extended range, extended reach, extended power projection. Targets once marked out of range were now within striking distance, and behind every one of those longer, deadlier missions lay the quiet genius of a man who had once flown alone across an ocean, and now, 2 decades later, taught a generation of fighter pilots how to go farther than they'd ever thought possible. Japanese bases that had once rested secure in their distance from Allied airfields now woke to the low, growing thunder of P-38 Lightnings overhead. The long silver fighters appeared where no American escort had ever reached before, sweeping across skies that had, until then, been a sanctuary. Thanks to Lindbergh's unorthodox techniques, range was no longer a limitation. The P-38s could now fly 950-mile missions, fight for a quarter hour over the target, and still return home with fuel to spare. What had been impossible months earlier became standard practice, transforming both tactics and strategy across the Pacific. The implications rippled outward like the wake of a stone cast into deep water. With extended range came new power. Bombers that once flew unescorted into danger now had fighter cover. MacArthur's advance toward the Philippines accelerated. Operations that would have taken months were completed in weeks. Airfields that had been out of reach were suddenly within the grasp of engineers and CBs. The difference was measured not merely in miles, but in time, in momentum, and in lives. For pilots, the change was personal and profound. The same men who had once returned to base with fuel gauges trembling on empty now landed with comfortable reserves. Storms that forced detours no longer meant certain loss. Damage in combat didn't automatically seal a pilot's fate. The new margin of endurance became a margin of survival. When MacArthur's forces invaded Leyte in October 1944, P-38s from New Guinea and Morotai provided fighter cover at distances previously deemed impossible. The difference between arriving over the target with fumes in the tanks or with an hour of fuel could mean the difference between victory and annihilation, and Lindbergh's methods made that difference real. Yet not everyone embraced the change at first. Some commanders bristled at the thought of adopting a civilian's ideas in a theater of war. Pilots, trained to fear the over-square settings Lindbergh recommended, remained skeptical. Maintenance officers worried that prolonged low RPM operation would wear out the Allisons prematurely. But data has a way of silencing debate. Engine failures didn't increase. Fuel consumption dropped dramatically. Mission logs recorded new successes. Targets once beyond reach now struck and destroyed. By the close of 1944, Lindbergh's unorthodox settings, 4,600 RPM, 30 inches manifold pressure, lean mixture, were no longer whispered rumors among squadrons. They were official doctrine. The U.S. Army Air Forces updated its P-38 manuals. New cruise charts incorporated Lindbergh's figures. Pilot training began to teach lean of peak operation, a phrase that, only months earlier, had sounded like heresy. What had begun as one man's field experiment had become a cornerstone of fighter operations. Behind this achievement lay a man wrestling not only with mechanical limits, but with his own redemption. Before the war, Charles Lindbergh had been a figure of near-mythic fame and then a man disgraced. His outspoken isolationism and his sympathy for aspects of German aviation had turned him from hero to pariah. His name, once synonymous with American courage, became a symbol of controversy and division. President Roosevelt himself had scorned him, but in the Pacific, far from Washington's politics and press, Lindbergh found restoration through action. Here, he wasn't judged by speeches or newspaper editorials. He was judged by what mattered most: skill, precision, courage. The pilots of the 475th Fighter Group didn't care what he'd said in 1941. They cared that he could fly, that he could teach them to go farther and come home alive. Even Major Richard Bong, America's top ace with 40 victories, told a United Press reporter, "Lindbergh's as hot a pilot as any of us. He'd have been out there knocking off Japs every day if General Kenny had let him." From Bong, such praise was worth more than any political pardon. It was acceptance by the brotherhood of combat aviators, the only absolution that mattered. After returning to the United States in August 1944, Lindbergh didn't fade quietly into retirement. At Patuxent River, he participated in joint Army-Navy conferences, testing captured Japanese aircraft and evaluating their flight characteristics. He continued to advise United Aircraft and other manufacturers, troubleshooting performance issues that plagued aircraft in the field. The technical record of what he achieved remains staggering. A standard P-38J Lightning carried 410 gallons internally, 2 90-gallon mains, 2 60-gallon reserves, and 2 55-gallon leading-edge tanks. With drop tanks, total fuel could exceed 1,000 gallons. Under standard cruise, 2200 RPM auto-rich mixture, fuel burn hovered far higher than it needed to be. Lindbergh's settings cut consumption to about 70 gallons per hour, extending combat radius from 570 to roughly 750 miles, a 31% increase. In practice, that meant 9-hour flights covering more than 1,000 miles. Over the vast Pacific, that wasn't a technical footnote. It was a strategic revolution. Fighter range defined the rhythm of the island-hopping campaign. It determined which islands had to be taken and which could be bypassed. By pushing the P-38's reach outward, Lindbergh changed the geometry of the war itself. Entire chains of islands could be leapfrogged, saving time, men, and material. Some later writers have mistakenly linked Lindbergh's range innovations to the April 1943 mission that ambushed Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor. That historic interception, flown by the 339th Fighter Squadron, was indeed a triumph of range and precision, but Lindbergh had nothing to do with it. He was still in the United States at the time. What Lindbergh accomplished was more subtle and more enduring. He took what had been extraordinary and made it routine. He turned a desperate one-off mission into an everyday operational reality. And in doing so, the man who had once flown alone across the Atlantic taught a generation of warriors how to cross the even greater distances of the Pacific, not just with courage, but with mastery. Imagine it for a moment. You are 42 years old, more than twice the age of many men in your squadron, yet you strap yourself into a fighter built for speed, endurance, and violence. The airframe trembles as you advance the throttles. The engines thunder, pressing you back against the seat. Out there, over the endless Pacific, are opponents 20 years your junior, faster on instinct perhaps, but not on understanding. This was Charles Lindbergh in 1944, not the triumphant hero of Paris, not the public figure of controversy, but a man once again proving himself through flight. The physical strain alone would have broken a lesser man. High G turns that crushed the body, hours confined in a cockpit so tight you could hardly shift your weight, the constant hum of the Allison engines vibrating through every bone. Yet he never complained, never asked for special privilege. He flew when they flew, fought when they fought, and lived, or might have died, by the same rules. And because he did, they believed him. If Lindbergh had stood behind a lectern at headquarters and lectured about fuel mixtures, no one would have listened. But he earned trust the only way that mattered in war, by flying the mission himself. Each sortie was a lesson written in motion, a demonstration that his methods worked not in theory, but in the thin air between life and death. Through that courage, he bridged the gulf between civilian intellect and military instinct, showing that a man outside the chain of command could still change the way the war was fought. His success carried a message far beyond fuel efficiency. It proved that technical mastery, even when it came from outside the uniformed ranks, could enhance combat power. In the chaos of modern warfare, knowledge had become as decisive as courage. Lindbergh's work encouraged officers to listen to the civilian engineers and test pilots who supported their aircraft in the field. The results were immediate and lasting: faster problem-solving, tighter collaboration, and an acceleration of innovation that helped the Allies keep pace with a war driven by technology. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning itself deserves a moment of reverence. It was an aircraft that seemed to have been waiting for a man like Lindbergh. Twin engines offering security over the ocean's vast emptiness, a complex fuel system that invited precision, and a stability in cruise flight that made it ideal for experimentation. The Allison V-1710s, though maligned by some, responded beautifully to careful handling. While the newer P-51 Mustang would come to dominate Europe's high-altitude skies, in the Pacific, the P-38 remained indispensable. Its twin engines gave pilots a safety margin over endless water. Its concentrated nose armament could shred enemy aircraft or shipping. Its agility at low and medium altitudes made it a perfect weapon for island warfare. And when flown using Lindbergh's fuel-saving techniques, its range became almost mythic. The numbers tell the tale. The 475th Fighter Group flying P-38s exclusively recorded 551 aerial victories, more than any other Lightning unit in the war. Among its pilots was Major Thomas McGuire, America's second highest scoring ace with 38 confirmed kills. Their dominance was not an accident of fate, but a testament to an aircraft that could fight farther, strike harder, and return home safer. All thanks to one man's rethinking of how engines breathe and burn. Multiply those fuel savings across thousands of sorties, across the vastness of the Pacific, and the result becomes impossible to quantify, but easy to feel. Lives spared, missions completed, victories achieved. Yet the story also exposes the uneasy marriage between genius and institution. Lindbergh's past politics had made him a marked man. President Roosevelt himself had barred him from military service, and yet, irony of ironies, the very military that had cast him out found itself relying on his brilliance. His official status, civilian technical representative, was a bureaucratic fiction, a way to bend the rules just enough to let him fly and fight without admitting it outright. It was irregular, even reckless by today's standards, but it worked. Pragmatism triumphed where rigidity would have failed. The pilots who flew beside him in 1944 never forgot. Decades later, their memories still carried the sharp clarity of those days in New Guinea. Colonel Warren Lewis, who had commanded the 402nd Squadron, could still quote Lindbergh's fuel settings from memory, minor variations appearing from pilot to pilot, but the principle unchanged. Less RPM, more manifold pressure, lean mixture, and trust the math. They remembered not just the technique, but the man who had taught it, quietly, precisely, fearlessly. Charles Augustus Lindbergh died on August 26, 1974, at 72. He slipped away at his home in Kipahulu, Maui, leaving behind hospitals and headlines for the solitude he had always sought. In a simple handmade coffin, built by Hawaiian cowboys, he was laid to rest just hours after his passing. No pomp, no ceremony, only 15 witnesses. His grave, lined with lava rock and black beach pebbles beneath the palms of Palapala Ho'omau Church Cemetery, bears a single verse from Psalm 139, "If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea," a fitting epitaph for a man whose life was defined by flight. When his wartime journals were published in 1970, readers discovered in his own words the precision and humility with which he had served. But his true legacy lies not on the page. It endures in principle, that technical knowledge and human courage together can redefine what is possible, that civilians given trust and purpose can strengthen even the most hardened military machine, and that sometimes redemption doesn't come through speeches or politics. It comes through the steady hum of engines, the long horizon ahead, and the courage to prove the impossible wrong. Picture the scene one last time, the Pacific horizon endless and blue, the war nearing its crescendo. The roar of engines fades into the wind, leaving only thought, reflection, and the quiet realization that not all revolutions are born from explosions. Some begin with a question: could this be done better? Institutional rules, rigid and time-tested, are the bones of any military machine. But bones can become brittle. Lindbergh's story reminds us that procedures must be questioned, refined, and rebuilt when evidence demands it. Progress does not come from obedience alone. It comes from courage, from proof, from those willing to say, "Let me show you another way," and show them he did. In the crucible of the Pacific, where distance itself was an enemy, Lindbergh united two worlds, the precision of engineering and the urgency of combat. The theater demanded what no manual could yet deliver: extreme range, relentless endurance. Fighters that could not only reach the enemy, but stay and fight before returning home. Standard doctrine said it could not be done. Lindbergh proved otherwise. For years he had studied the alchemy of fuel, air, and power, the art of coaxing more from an engine than the textbooks allowed. Now, with the Pacific as his laboratory and his own life as collateral, he applied that expertise in the one arena that respected only results. He didn't command. He collaborated. He didn't lecture. He demonstrated. And that made all the difference. Imagine it. A civilian among hardened fighter pilots, not demanding respect, but earning it. Shoulder to shoulder in the briefing tent, sweat and oil on his flight suit, not celebrity, but comrade. His fame meant nothing here, only performance mattered. Each time he climbed into a P-38 and proved his theories under fire, skepticism turned into belief. If history often celebrates the thunder of victory, Lindbergh's triumph was quieter, a victory of understanding over assumption, of knowledge over hierarchy. Think of the German prisoners of war who, upon seeing the unstoppable flow of American industry, grasped the power of a free and resourceful society. Their conversion came from material proof, from factories and abundance that defied their indoctrination. Lindbergh's fellow pilots experienced a different revelation, a technical awakening. Through one man's demonstrated mastery, they learned that the limits of their machines were not fixed by manuals, but by imagination and precision. Both stories, the prisoners and the pilots, illuminate the same truth. Sometimes the greatest conquests are not won by force, but by knowledge applied with elegance and courage. The P-38 Lightning, with its unmistakable twin-boom silhouette, carried that legacy until war's end. Pilots remembered its quirks, its temperamental systems, but also its strength and grace, and the quiet lessons of the man who had unlocked its hidden potential. To those who flew with him in 1944, Lindbergh was the civilian who taught them that impossible simply meant untried. He showed them that the numbers printed in manuals were not boundaries but starting points, that with insight and discipline, even a fully developed system could evolve further. That was his true Pacific legacy, not in the number of sorties flown, nor in the single aerial victory he claimed, but in the transformation of understanding. He arrived as an observer and left as a teacher. He came as a celebrity and departed as a brother in arms. And he changed an aircraft's very soul, not with new parts or inventions, but through clarity of thought and the courage to prove a better way existed. The pilots of Satan's Angels, the 475th Fighter Group, never forgot. They flew farther, fought longer, and returned home safer, because one man shared his knowledge freely. His method spread from squadron to squadron, reshaping the air war across the Pacific. And that, perhaps, is the quiet genius of Lindbergh's story. A man who once crossed an ocean alone found 17 years later that the same mastery of efficiency and endurance could help win a far greater struggle. The principle never changed. Know your machine completely, manage its lifeblood precisely, and never accept that the written limit is the real one. For 6 brief weeks in the summer of 1944, Charles Lindbergh lived that creed among the warriors of the Pacific. In doing so, he proved that the most powerful weapon of all is understanding, tested in battle, shared among comrades, and carried forward on the wings of those who dared to believe that better was possible.